Hi everyone, Kendall here for our second week in our continuing series of Brackman blocks from the Encyclopaedia of Pieced Quilt Patterns. Why can I never say that? And the majority of you spoke last week, and we will continue with the spinning wheel, and I'll also continue showing you the blocks I've rejected and explaining to you why we're not going to go ahead with that. And from this week forward, the rejected block you will also get cutting directions for, just in case you want to make it. In some instances, those blocks won't be the 12-inch mark, which is why some of them are also rejected. So without much further ado, grab a beverage, grab your fabric, come with me, and I'll show you how I do it. Block number 1621 gives us the Independence Square. This was from Famous Features. It was a syndicated mail order source that still sells pattern booklets from a New York address. Some pattern collectors call them the Q books, since each number is preceded by the letter Q. They appear to have begun in the 1940s, probably an outgrowth of Capers Weekly patterns. Mabel Obenchain is the author most commonly mentioned. This is a 9-inch block as you see it here, and translating it to a 12-inch block, it lost its feel and didn't look quite right. So we're not going to do this one, but I will have cutting information for it if you are interested. So let's spin that wheel again. Block number 1657 gives us the ribbon quilt, whose name becomes clear when you see it on repeat at the end of the video. This appeared in a syndicated mail order column which was written by Florence LeGank Harris, who we've met before, and it appeared in many periodicals throughout the late 20s and 40s. As this block is made up mainly of half square triangles with one solid square in the center, our cutting instructions for this week are quite simple. So we're going to start by making our half square triangles, and we could do these using the 8 at a time method, but you would need to cut a large 10 to 10.5 inch square for that. So depending on what fabric you're using, you can just cut the 5-inch squares, and I have shown the 8 at a time method many times in the past. So for the 2 at a time half square triangle methods, what you just saw me doing there was drawing a diagonal line on the back of all of our A squares, and we need to match these up right sides together with our C squares. I am using a somewhat directional fabric, so you'll see here that I've placed 2 of those pieces with the pattern going vertically and 2 with it going horizontally. That will mean that once I've created all of my half square triangles, I can keep the direction of the fabric all going in the same direction. Once we've matched those right sides together, we will take those to the machine and stitch 1/4 inch on each side of our drawn line. I then like to give those a press to settle the stitches down and release any tension caused by sewing along the bias. We then cut them in half along our diagonal line and press them all to the dark side, and then we're ready to trim them down. We now need to trim our half square triangles down, and you can use whichever method you prefer, but for me, I like to stack them 2 at a time by nesting that middle seam as tightly as I can, and this is just a quick thing for me because I'm impatient. I then take my square ruler and I locate the 45-degree line. I place that along my stitching line, and I make sure that I have enough fabric outside my trim down measurement of 4.5 inches on all 4 sides, including underneath the ruler. We can then trim away those first 2 sides. We then rotate that around really carefully to make sure that it stays nesting. You could use a rotating mat at this point. Line up your trim down measurement of 4.5 inches on those freshly cut sides. Make sure that your diagonal line is still along your stitching, and trim the final 2 sides. Sometimes doing them 2 at a time isn't possible because they may have distorted when you press the seam. So pay careful attention to make sure that you are actually trimming both of them when you use this method. You will sometimes see me revert back to single unit trimming, and that's because I can't guarantee to get the perfect measurement by having both lined up together. For some reason, I find if I trim them before I've pressed them, I don't get as accurate a result, and I think that's got to do with how heavy-handed I am with the iron and the fact that I iron instead of press. But who can say? Anyway, trim all 8 of your half square triangles down, and then we are actually ready to lay this block out. As I said, we are now ready to lay this block out, and you may or may not have noticed from the last video that I am in a different workspace. I decided I needed an upgrade to my sewing table, so I've bought one where, as you can see, the machine sits down in, but what that's done is given me a reduced space to work in. So I've gone from an 18 by 24 mat down to a 12 by 18, and we'll do our best to fit everything in. As I am working with that directional fabric, and I want my design to run vertically along the block. When I made the half square triangles, you saw that I alternated which way I did them, which gives me half square triangles that I can set out the way that I want, but I just need to play around with them a little bit first to find the right ones. So refer back to the diagram on our cutting sheet for how this block gets laid out. Lay everything out, and then we are ready to do our 9-patch construction. As we all would be fully aware by now, to do the 9-patch construction, we start by sewing all of our vertical seams and then our horizontal seams. Nothing fancy with the pressing for these ones. On the top and the bottom row, we will press out towards the corners, which does put you up against that little bit of bulk from the half square triangle. I find giving it a little bit of heat first lets you press that over nicely without distorting your block. So we'll do that on the top and the bottom row. For the center row, we will press in towards that solid background square. And then when we come to do our horizontal seams, everything will nest nicely. Because we do have some half square triangles coming together in these seam allowances, for this horizontal seam I am going to spin that intersection, and we have done this many times in a lot of our blocks because it spreads out the bulk a lot more evenly and is a lot more friendly when you do come to quilt your quilt. So what we do is we just pick out the few stitches that are above our horizontal stitching line on both sides. That allows us to open out our seam allowance, and we will spin that in the same direction as our vertical seam. So in this instance, for this side, we are spinning them in a clockwise direction. As you can see, I didn't quite get all of the stitches out, so I've had to have a little bit of a tug on that. And sometimes you may need to bring in your seam ripper to make sure that you get all of the little stitches that may be catching it out so that you get the flattest intersection possible. On the left-hand side here, you'll see that the seam allowances will go in an anti-clockwise direction, and that puts everything on this seam sitting as flat as possible. So we'll get this done. We'll attach our last row onto the block, making sure that it still looks the same rather than putting the bottom on the top and the top on the bottom. Keep the middle in the middle. And we'll once again spin those seams, and this block is done. I do have an alternate piecing method for you, and we'll also go over the AccuQuilt following this one. So we can make this block with sew and flips in place of the half square triangles by starting with an elongated rectangle. Now, this does leave you with a little bit of waste, but for my purposes, I'm going to use the waste. So there are benefits to using the half square triangles in that there is very little waste, but doing this sew and flip method will alleviate that seam in the center. And so if you have a fabric that you just don't want to cut in half with a seam, this will be the way to go. So we're going to start with our A squares, which we need 9 of, and 4 of our B rectangles. Now we need to put a sew and flip on each end of our B rectangles with the angle going in the same direction. The angle that we want is achieved by placing our B rectangle vertically on the table in front of us. That is the skinny end towards your tummy. We're going to draw a line on the back of our A square and take that over to our machine and stitch just to the right of that drawn line. A lot of tutorials tell you to stitch directly on the line, but I find when you fold that back over, the amount of cloth or fabric that is taken up by your stitches isn't allowed for, and you don't get perfectly meeting edges. In my example today, as you'll see in a moment, I didn't quite get it right and my edges don't line up, so I unpick it and I do it again. Because after we have stitched this, we do want to test fold and make sure that everything is lining up and our rectangle is the exact same size that we started with. So you'll see here that, and I know that it's white on white, that I didn't quite get that. And if I was to just trim away the back 2 layers, I wouldn't have a rectangle anymore. I'd have some wonky other shape that who can say what that is. So I'm going to unstitch that and do it again, and on my second attempt, I am much happier. So now that we're happy with how our piece is looking and that we've maintained our exact same size rectangle with even edges, we press that into place before trimming away those excess layers 1/4 inch away from our stitching line. And I am going to save those offcuts and trim them down to 3.5 inches to make the 9-inch block that I need for what I would normally do with the AccuQuilt. So stay tuned for that. Now that we've gotten that done, I hear you ask, why didn't you use your folded corner clipper tool, Kendall? Isn't that your favorite? Well, we're going to do the rest of these with the folded corner clipper. I just wanted to show you that I can and am able to do it the traditional way, even if I always miss on my first attempt, and that is always captured on video. To make sure that we get the exact same angle, which is what we're looking for, we once again place our large rectangle vertically on the table in front of us, the short end towards our tummy. We then place our folded corner clipper tool on there, lining up our 4.5 inch marks, which is the size of these sew and flip corners, and we slice away that excess fabric first. We then take that to our machine and we stitch our 1/4 inch seam and press those corners out away from the large rectangle. I'm going to get all of these done probably off camera and come back because this block needs to go together with a partial seam. And through the magic of television, and it was only about 7 minutes of footage that I removed, we are now ready to lay this block out with all 4 of our sew and flip units now made. You will see when I'm laying these out that we can't piece this in the traditional method, so we need to use what is known as a partial seam. Where the partial seam comes in is when we attach this first piece, we will only sew about halfway along that seam from the end, and then we will reverse our machine to lock our stitches in place. So I'm just going to mark that with a pin, just to remind myself that I'm not sewing the whole way across this piece. Once we have this first piece attached, you'll see we can then add our next piece around in the clockwise direction, because we will have the full length of fabric to sew that onto. We continue around in this fashion until we've attached our last piece, and then we go back and we finish that partial seam off, once again back stitching in the middle to make sure that we lock it in place. This is actually quite simple. A lot of people are afraid of partial seams, but they're actually quite easy and they are your friend. So with our final piece attached, we just now have to complete the partial seam that we started with. And you would have noticed that throughout, I pressed out towards our sew and flip segments, except for that first one where I pressed in towards the background square. But that doesn't really matter. You can press in whichever direction you like. So now we just need to finish this seam off and it will no longer be a partial seam. And as I said, we'll sew down to where we had our lock stitches before. We'll once again backstitch just to make sure that's locked into place and give that a final press out away from the center. Now, because when I use my AccuQuilt, I do end up with a 9-inch block. As I said before, I'm just using the cutaways from my sew and flips to make my 9-inch version. But for the AccuQuilt, you will need shapes 3 and 1. 3 will make your half square triangles and 1 is the block in the center. As I already had all those half square triangles from my cutaways, I just simply press those and trim them down, and I'm ready to put together my 9-inch finished block, which I would normally create from the AccuQuilt. And this goes together in exactly the same way as the first one. So the name of this block was Ribbon Quilt, and you can see that once you put it on repeat, those fabric stripes or the fabric halves of the half square triangles do actually make quite a beautiful secondary pattern. You can, if you do choose, however, to separate those blocks out with sashing and cornerstones, but I think doing this you do lose the effect of those ribbons dancing around the quilt. The original version without the sashing would look stunning with all different colors, making sure that each arm of the ribbon matched up, and it would be quite visually stimulating and very pleasing to the eye, as we can see here. Alrighty folks, that does it for another week. And how amazing does this block look on repeat rather than just being on its own? And I had to play around with putting in the different colors. To make the quilt that way, you would really need to plan it out in advance and be sure of where you're placing each of your colors, but it does give quite a stunning result. As always, I'd love if you would like the video, share it with a friend that you think may be interested, subscribe if you haven't already done so, it really helps me out. But when you do subscribe, make sure you tickle that little bell icon and then you'll be notified of all my upcoming releases and you won't miss a thing. I'll see you all again real soon. Bye for now.